I've seen an increasing number of people online saying that they wish boxing was like the UFC in terms of its structure. Because the narrative is that with UFC, the best fight the best all the time on a regular basis. When those fights get ordered, they happen. There's no network rivalry that stands in the way. There's no promotional rivalries that stand in the way because everybody's under the same promotional group, UFC, on the same network. So the narrative is that that's a much better structure to have. The narrative is that if you are a UFC champion, it's equivalent to being the undisputed champion in boxing. Well, the problem with that narrative is that it's a false narrative. Because the UFC is just one MMA promotional house. And I call it a house because UFC does everything in-house. Yeah? See, the thing with the UFC is that because they're so much bigger than any other MMA house, it gives a lot of people this false perception that they're the only show in town and that anything outside of UFC doesn't really matter. But the reality is, you've got many other MMA houses out there. For example, Bellator, which is probably the second most well-known after UFC. How often do you see UFC champions fighting Bellator champions? I mean, that's no different than what you have in boxing, where the fighters who are champions of one sanctioning body or one promotional group often won't fight the champions of a different promotional group. But as I say, with UFC, because they're so much bigger than any of the competition, people actually forget that the competition exists. I'm sure some MMA people will argue that if you really are that good, you'll be in the UFC. You won't be in Bellator. And I'm no MMA expert. I've watched MMA for many, many years. Here and there, it's never been my go-to sport, but I have watched it. I even watched the early UFC back in the 90s when they first started, when you had the Gracies, and I remember watching, it might have been UFC 1 with the big black sumo wrestler, Emmanuel Yarbrough. So I watched my fair amount of MMA and UFC over the years, although, I'm not going to say that I'm any kind of MMA expert. I'm definitely an MMA casual. But still, if any of you people who are far more well-versed in MMA than me want to correct me on anything here, then please do. I'm happy for you to correct me. But as far as I'm aware, there are multiple MMA houses, and the champions of UFC, etc., don't fight the champions of Bellator. So it's not like having an undisputed champion in boxing. An undisputed champion in boxing is somebody who more than likely has fought people to collect those belts who are signed with other promoters, who are on other networks. That's usually how somebody becomes undisputed. They have to fight cross-network fights and, fighters who are with other promoters. You don't see that happen in MMA. But because the UFC have built themselves up so big and made themselves look like the only show in town, people act as though it's like being an undisputed champion. Really and truly, what UFC do is what Al Heyman is trying to do in the welterweight division. Have an in-house, incestuous little situation where all his top fighters are fighting each other on a regular basis. I mean, we just had Keith Thurman Pacquiao. Then we had Errol Spence, Sean Porter. Now we're probably going to get Errol Spence, Danny Garcia. I mean, that's the same as what goes on in the UFC. Al Heyman is trying to make Terence Crawford irrelevant, just the way that the UFC have made people believe that the competition doesn't really exist. Doing everything in-house and acting as though, well, if you're not in the UFC, you're not really that good anyway. That's what Al Heyman's trying to do. But people are complaining about it, and rightfully so. I'm complaining about it. So I don't think the UFC model is the way to go for boxing. I don't think so. Because you're never going to be able to unify the whole world of boxing in every country under one promotional group. That's not going to happen. They don't even have that in MMA, so they're not going to have that in boxing. Not anytime soon anyway, not within the next few decades. So what's this desire for it to be like UFC? It's just an illusion. There are plenty of top MMA fighters out there who are not in the UFC. The same with other MMA houses. They just don't get the recognition. And because they don't get the recognition, you think they're not that good, or people assume they're not that good. Maybe they are. Another thing I don't like about the UFC, well, it's got it right here. Let me try and find it here. It's a very long article on Wikipedia, but it's the treatment of the fighters. I don't like that in UFC. You know, UFC as a brand is bigger and more well known than any of the fighters. Whereas in boxing, that's not the case. Anthony Joshua is a bigger brand. He's not necessarily a bigger financial entity, but he's a bigger brand than Matchroom Boxing, his promoter. Yes, he is. You walk down the street in the UK and ask somebody if they know Matchroom, and most people will be like, who? But ask them if they know Anthony Joshua, and everybody knows him. So Anthony Joshua is a bigger brand than Matchroom Boxing. Canelo Alvarez is a bigger brand than Golden Boy. But in the UFC, it's not like that. In the UFC, with the very, very few exceptions, you know, like the Conor McGregors and maybe Ronda Rousey, very few exceptions, for the most part, the UFC as a brand is bigger than the fighters. And that keeps the Dana Whites and, you know, the board members or whatever at that company in a position of power over the fighters themselves. My understanding of the business model with UFC is that it's kind of like the old days, actually, of boxing, in terms of how little power and control the fighters have. And the fighters, the top fighters, the champions, etc. in UFC don't get paid anywhere near as much as the top fighters in boxing. Well, how can that be? Because UFC is an extremely successful promotional entity. They make loads of money. Well, with all the money they're making, why are their fighters not getting paid as much as top boxers are getting paid? Because very few boxing promoters are making the kind of money that UFC is making, if any. So how come the boxing promoters who are making less are paying their fighters more? Generally. What's that all about? So, no, I don't like the UFC business model where they're fleecing fighters, in my opinion. I don't like it. Yeah, fighters still get paid millions and all that kind of business, and they get endorsements and sponsorships. But the fact that the UFC is bigger than the fighters, nah, I don't like it. I was looking for, where is it here? There was something that talked about lawsuits. It's such a long list here about the UFC. I did find it earlier on, but I can't. Where is it? Oh, here we go. Yeah, lawsuits over contractual treatment of fighters. So there have been multiple lawsuits. You know, I remember when Rampage Jackson had his ups and downs with Dana White. And I remember the way Dana White was talking about Rampage Jackson. It's as if Rampage was his property or something. You know? I didn't like that. Didn't like it at all. those are my thoughts on this growing call for boxing to become like the UFC. Yeah, the UFC doesn't envelop the entire world of MMA. It's just one promotional house. There are others. It just happens to be so big that people forget that the others exist, or they don't take the others as seriously. They act as though if you're anybody in MMA, you have to be in the UFC. But that's just an illusion. Yeah. They don't have an overarching promotional group for the entirety of MMA, and they don't have that for boxing. And I don't ever see them having that for boxing, and probably not in our lifetimes. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. It's Hatman, I'm out.
Join me on Patreon. I upload a minimum of 2 podcasts every single week, covering a wide variety of controversial topics, as well as live stream Q&A sessions. Take a look on screen right now at some of the podcasts I've produced so far. For just $3 a month, the equivalent of about £2 a month, you get access to all my new podcasts and my entire back catalogue of past podcasts, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen on your computer or on your smartphone or tablet by downloading the Patreon app from the Google Play Store or the App Store for free. The Patreon app also allows you to download each podcast in MP3. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, you get access to dozens of hours of exclusive content. It's easy to sign up, there's no contract, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.